At the country estate, the Duke trades his title for silence, posing as a butler to watch the woman he's sworn to marry. Then midnight comes, and a confession slips through a door. What he hears doesn't just test their engagement, it breaks everything he thought was true. The mist clung to Ashford Manor like an unwelcome memory, thick and persistent, obscuring the gardens that had once been the envy of 3 counties. Eleanor stood at the drawing-room window, her reflection ghostly against the grey morning, and considered the particular cruelty of fog, how it revealed nothing while making everything feel closer than it was. Behind her, the letter lay open on the escritoire. She had read it 3 times, though once would have sufficed. The words were clear enough: His Grace, the Duke of Greystone, is amenable to the proposed arrangement and shall visit Ashford Manor at the fortnight's end to formalize terms. No mention of affection. No pretense of romance. Just terms, as though she were property to be appraised and acquired. You haven't touched your tea. Eleanor turned to find her sister, Catherine, hovering near the doorway with that particular expression of concern that had become permanent these past months. At 17, Catherine still possessed the luminous hope that their mother had once carried, before debts and disappointments had carved her into something brittle. It's gone cold, Eleanor replied, though she hadn't noticed. Catherine crossed the room, her footsteps muffled by carpets that needed replacing. Everything needed replacing. The house maintained its facade of gentility through sheer force of habit, but the cracks were showing, in the servants they could no longer afford, in the meals that had grown simpler, in the way their mother's laughter had disappeared entirely. Lady Anne sent word. She'll call this afternoon. Catherine picked up the letter, skimming it with hungry eyes. A duke, Eleanor. You'll be a duchess. I'll be useful, Eleanor corrected, gently taking the letter back. There's a difference. Her sister's face fell, and Eleanor immediately regretted her sharpness. Catherine hadn't chosen this any more than she had. Their father's investments had failed spectacularly and silently, a gentleman's ruin accomplished through bad judgment rather than vice. The title remained, Lady Eleanor Ashford would always carry those words before her name, but titles purchased nothing when creditors came calling. The marriage would solve everything. The Duke of Greystone possessed wealth enough to ensure Catherine's future, to restore their mother's standing, to prevent the slow slide into genteel poverty that consumed women of their class like a wasting disease. All it required was Eleanor's agreement to become a stranger's wife. I apologize, Eleanor said softly, touching her sister's hand. I'm merely tired. You're frightened. Catherine's directness, so rare in their carefully mannered world, struck true. But they say he's honorable, Eleanor. Cold, perhaps, but not cruel. Cold. The word followed the Duke of Greystone through every drawing-room conversation, every whispered exchange. His first wife had died years ago, childbirth, the usual tragedy, and he'd reportedly retreated into his estates and his duties with the passion of a man entering a tomb. No scandals. No mistresses. No warmth. Eleanor had seen his portrait once, at an exhibition, dark-haired, severe, with eyes that seemed to calculate rather than observe. A man who had learned to feel nothing, or had chosen to. Perhaps they would suit each other perfectly. 2 people playing roles, executing duty without the dangerous complication of hope. I should dress, Eleanor said, though Lady Anne wouldn't arrive for hours. The household. The household will manage. Catherine squeezed her hand. Eleanor, you needn't be brave every moment. But she did. Bravery was the only currency she had left. After Catherine departed, Eleanor remained at the window, watching the fog shift and reform. Somewhere beyond that grey curtain, the Duke of Greystone was likely reading a similar letter, evaluating a transaction that would bind them both. She wondered if he felt anything at all, or if that particular capacity had been buried with his first duchess. The thought should have troubled her. Instead, she found it almost comforting. A man who felt nothing could not be disappointed. Could not discover, as Philip Carey had, that a woman with a title but no fortune was only half a prize. Eleanor pressed her palm against the cold glass, leaving a print that faded almost instantly. In 2 weeks, everything would change. She would become the Duchess of Greystone, mistress of an estate she'd never seen, wife to a man whose face she knew only from oil and canvas. The fog pressed closer, and Eleanor closed her eyes. Let him be cold, she prayed silently. Let him ask nothing of me but duty. It seemed, in that moment, like the kindest possibility. William Hartwell had made many questionable decisions in his 32 years, but standing in the servants' entrance of Ashford Manor at dawn, dressed in borrowed clothes and carrying forged references, ranked among his most morally indefensible. Yet here he stood. "You'll be wanting Mrs. Graves, then." The scullery maid who'd answered his knock looked him over with the practiced skepticism of someone who'd seen her share of drifters. "She handles the hiring, what little there is of it." William nodded, keeping his posture carefully deferential. He'd practiced this, the slight stoop of the shoulders, the lowered gaze, the economy of speech that marked a man who knew his place. The role of William Hartwell, Duke of Greystone, required performance. Apparently, so did the role of William Harris, gentleman's servant seeking employment. The irony wasn't lost on him. Mrs. Graves proved to be a severe woman with iron-grey hair and the bearing of a general inspecting troops. She examined his references with narrowed eyes, and William felt an uncomfortable flutter of anxiety. The documents were excellent forgeries, his solicitor had seen to that, but forgeries nonetheless. "You've experience in a ducal household," she said, not quite a question. "Yes, ma'am. 10 years in service." The lie came smoothly, rehearsed until it felt almost true. "And you're seeking a position here." Her tone suggested she found this suspect. Ashford Manor was hardly a step up from anywhere. William had prepared for this. "I seek a quieter situation, ma'am. The larger houses, there's politics among the staff that weary a man." Something flickered in Mrs. Graves' expression. Understanding, perhaps, or simply exhaustion. "Quiet we have in abundance, Mr. Harris. Ambition less so." She set down the references. "We've no position for a valet, but we're short of footmen since Thomas left for factory work. The pay is modest. That will suffice." She studied him a moment longer, and William wondered if she could see through the careful construction he'd built. If she noticed that his hands, though he deliberately roughened them, had never known truly hard labor. If his speech, though he'd flattened its aristocratic edges, still carried too much education. "You'll start today," Mrs. Graves finally said. "Mr. Palmer will show you your duties. We maintain standards here, Mr. Harris, regardless of circumstance. Lady Eleanor insists upon it." There it was, the name that had brought him to this deception. Lady Eleanor Ashford. His intended bride. The woman whose politely worded acceptance of his proposal had contained not one word of warmth, curiosity, or anything resembling feeling. Just elegant penmanship and perfect grammar arranging the terms of her own disposal. He'd told himself he needed to understand who she truly was. That a man who'd been deceived once, so thoroughly, so devastatingly, had the right to certainty before binding himself again. That observation was prudence, not violation. Standing in the servants' hall of her declining manor, the justification felt thinner than it had in his study at Greystone. Mr. Palmer, the elderly butler, assigned William to morning duties, fires to be laid, silver to be polished, the endless invisible labor that kept the household functioning. William had theoretically known such work existed. Actually performing it proved illuminating and humbling in equal measure. He first saw Eleanor at noon, descending the main staircase as he crossed the entrance hall with coal scuttles. She moved with extraordinary containment, as though she'd learned to occupy the smallest possible space. Her dress was well made but not new, a deep green that might once have flattered but now seemed merely practical. She noticed him with the brief, impersonal glance one gave to furniture, and continued past. No acknowledgement. No curiosity. No recognition, of course, how could there be? William set down the scuttles and watched her disappear into the morning room. Even her footsteps seemed careful, measured, designed not to disturb. This was the woman who would become his duchess. The stranger he'd agreed to marry. The person he'd reduced to an equation of suitability and risk. Shame touched him then, sharp and unwelcome. But not sharp enough, apparently, to send him back to Greystone with an honest confession. He picked up the coal scuttles and continued his work, and told himself he'd learn what he needed to know and end this deception before real harm was done. Later, he would recognize this as the moment when he could have chosen differently. The moment he didn't. Lady Anne Pembroke arrived precisely at 3, as she always did, bringing with her the crisp energy of someone who'd never learned to apologize for occupying space. Eleanor heard the carriage before she saw it, and felt the small unwinding in her chest that Anne's presence always brought, the sense that for an hour or two, she might set down the careful performance of resignation. "You look dreadful," Anne announced, sweeping into the drawing room and kissing Eleanor's cheek. "Though I suppose that's appropriate, given you've just agreed to marry a man renowned for his warmth and joviality." Anne. But Eleanor smiled despite herself. "Don't envy me. We both know what this is." Her friend settled onto the settee with the grace of someone whose father's shipping fortune had survived every economic storm. "A transaction. A rescue. Certainly not a love match." Eleanor poured tea with steady hands. "I never expected a love match." "No, you expected Philip Carey to possess a spine, and we saw how that turned out." And accepted her cup with a knowing look. "At least the Duke is honest about his mercenary nature. There's dignity in that, I suppose." The mention of Philip still stung, though Eleanor had thought herself past it. He'd courted her with poetry and promises, right up until her father's financial troubles became public knowledge. Then he'd simply evaporated, as though their understanding had been a misunderstanding all along. "The Duke requires an heir," Eleanor said quietly. "I require security for Catherine. It's fair." Fair. What a bloodless word for marriage. And set down her cup. "You deserve more than fair, Eleanor. Deserve has nothing to do with anything." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the house settle around them. From somewhere below came the muffled sounds of the servants going about their work, a reminder that even reduced circumstances required maintenance. "There's something odd about your new footman," Anne said abruptly. Eleanor blinked at the non sequitur. "I beg your pardon." "The dark-haired one. I passed him in the hall. He stands wrong." "Stands wrong?" And made an impatient gesture. "His posture. It's too good." And when he stepped aside, he moved like someone accustomed to others moving for him, not the reverse. She leaned forward, eyes bright with curiosity. "Where did Mrs. Graves find him?" "I've no idea. I don't involve myself in household hiring." Eleanor felt vaguely defensive, though she couldn't say why. She'd barely noticed the new servant, a dark-haired man with careful movements and downcast eyes. Unremarkable, as servants were meant to be. "Well, he's either fallen significantly in the world, or he's pretending to be something he's not." And settled back with the satisfaction of someone who'd spotted a puzzle. "Mark my words." Eleanor didn't mark them. She had larger concerns than the background of a footman, and Anne's tendency to find intrigue in mundane circumstances was well established. Still, later that evening, when the new servant, Harris, she thought his name was, brought in the lamps, she found herself watching him more closely. He moved efficiently, with an economy that suggested competence. His hands were broad, the nails clean but not manicured. When he bent to light the fire, there was a slight hesitation, as though he were thinking through the mechanics rather than following muscle memory. "Have you been in service long, Mr. Harris?" The question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. He straightened, keeping his eyes appropriately lowered. 10 years, my lady." His voice was educated, too educated, perhaps, for a footman. But then, the world was full of educated men reduced to positions below their learning. The economic crisis had devoured everyone, regardless of accomplishment. I hope you'll find Ashford Manor agreeable. Very agreeable, my lady. Thank you. He finished with the fire and departed, and Eleanor returned to her book, dismissing the brief exchange as meaningless. But something nagged at her, the same instinct that had warned her about Philip, too late to matter. She'd learned not to trust that instinct. It had failed her when it counted. So she ignored it, turned the page, and told herself that a servant's background was none of her concern. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, hiding everything. William had been at Ashford Manor for 6 days when he discovered the music room. He'd been tasked with checking the rarely used chambers for dampness, a duty that seemed designed to keep idle hands occupied rather than address any genuine concern. The east wing had been partially closed off, sheets draped over furniture like shrouds, and the air held that particular stillness of spaces where no one ventured. The pianoforte sat near the window, uncovered, dust motes dancing in the thin afternoon light. Someone used this room, then. Someone who wished to remain unobserved. He should have left. Should have completed his inspection and returned to duties that didn't involve lurking in the private spaces of a woman he was actively deceiving. Instead, he found himself examining the sheet music left open on the stand, Beethoven, the annotations in the margins written in a careful, feminine hand. Asterisk too fast here. Remember, anger, not chaos, asterisk. The insight startled him. He'd heard the piece performed dozens of times in dozens of drawing rooms, always with technical precision and emotional vapidity. The idea that someone in this house understood the difference between the two seemed impossible. Mr. Palmer is looking for you. William turned to find Eleanor in the doorway, and felt his heart perform an uncomfortable maneuver. She wore a simple day dress, her hair loosely arranged, and in the unguarded light of the abandoned wing, she looked younger than her 23 years. Tired, but younger. My lady. He bowed, perhaps too deeply. I was checking for dampness. Mrs. Graves' instructions. In the music room? Her tone suggested polite disbelief. How thorough. He'd been caught, or nearly so. I heard this room was in use. I didn't wish to overlook it. Eleanor moved past him to the pianoforte, running one finger along the keys without pressing them. It's the one space my mother doesn't enter. She finds music melancholy now. A pause. I find it honest. The statement hung between them, more intimate than she'd likely intended. William knew he should excuse himself, retreat to the appropriate distance between servant and lady. Instead, he heard himself say, the Beethoven. Do you play it as annotated? Her eyes snapped to his, suddenly sharp. You read music. Too late, he realized his error. A footman might read, might even be educated, but casually discussing musical interpretation suggested a background he supposedly didn't possess. My previous employer had a son who played, he said quickly. I often turned pages. The lie tasted worse each time. They accumulated, these small deceits, building into something he couldn't quite justify even to himself. Eleanor studied him with an expression he couldn't read. Suspicion, perhaps, or merely curiosity. You have opinions on Beethoven, then, Mr. Harris? Only that anger and chaos are often confused. In music as in life. Why had he said that? What was wrong with him? But Eleanor's expression softened, just slightly. Yes. Exactly that. She sat at the instrument, her posture transforming into something more certain. Most people perform it like a tantrum. But it's not that. It's, she paused, fingers hovering over the keys. It's the anger of someone who has every right to rage but chooses precision instead. She played then, just a fragment, and William understood immediately what the annotations meant. The fury was there, but contained, channeled into something almost unbearably controlled. It was devastating. When she stopped, the silence felt heavier than the music. Thank you, Mr. Harris. Her voice had returned to its careful neutrality. That will be all. He bowed and left, but the image followed him, Eleanor at the pianoforte, playing Anger Like a Prayer, alone in a room no one visited. That evening, he wrote to his solicitor, instructing him to ensure the music room at Greystone Manor was prepared and properly maintained. Then he stared at the letter, wondering what exactly he thought he was doing. Learning about her, he told himself. Understanding the woman he'd marry. But the truth, which he was beginning to recognize with growing discomfort, was simpler and more damning. He was constructing a version of Eleanor Ashford built from stolen moments and overheard confidences, a woman he had no right to know, assembled from observations she'd never consented to share. And somewhere in the process, William Hartwell had begun to forget which role he was playing. The Duke of Greystone was expected in 3 days, and Ashford Manor had mobilized with the intensity of an army preparing for inspection. Every surface gleamed, every curtain had been beaten free of dust, and the staff moved with heightened purpose born of anxiety and the slim hope that continued employment might follow a successful visit. Eleanor observed the preparations with detached interest, as though they concerned someone else entirely. In a sense, they did. The woman who would greet the Duke, who would smile appropriately and demonstrate her suitability, was a performance she'd been rehearsing her entire life. The self who played Beethoven in abandoned rooms had nothing to do with it. The roses need cutting back, her mother announced at breakfast, barely touching her toast. Lady Catherine Ashford had grown thinner these past months, her beauty turning brittle. We can't have the Duke thinking we've let the gardens go entirely. The gardens have gone entirely, Catherine said with the bluntness of youth. No amount of pruning will disguise it. Catherine. Eleanor's tone was gentle but firm. Her sister subsided, returning to her eggs with a chastened expression. The truth was that Catherine was right. The gardens, like everything else, showed their neglect. But appearances were currency in their world, and even debased currency retained some value if polished sufficiently. William learned of the Duke's impending arrival from Mrs. Graves, who delivered the news with the grim satisfaction of a general announcing battle orders. Extra staff would be hired temporarily, day workers from the village to supplement their reduced household. Everything had to be perfect. The irony of preparing for his own arrival threatened to choke him. He'd set this deception in motion thinking he'd need merely a week, perhaps 2, to understand Eleanor's character. Instead, nearly a fortnight had passed, and he understood less than ever. She was contained, yes, but not cold. Reserved, but not unfeeling. She moved through her days with the precision of someone who'd learned that economy of emotion was survival, and he'd found nothing, that suggested deception or avarice. Only exhaustion. And a kind of quiet resignation that made his chest ache. He found her in the library that afternoon, standing on a step stool to reach a high shelf, and watched her fingers trail across spines with the tenderness other women reserved for jewels. "May I assist, my lady?" She startled slightly, then regained her composure with visible effort. "Mr. Harris." "Yes, if you would." The Montaigne, the brown volume, third from the left. He retrieved it, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. She pulled back as though burned, and he felt the loss of that momentary contact with an intensity that alarmed him. "You're familiar with Montaigne?" she asked, descending the stool with careful grace. Another trap of his own making. "I've heard the name, my lady." He wrote about friendship. About how true connection requires honesty so complete it's almost violence. She opened the book, though he suspected she wasn't reading. I wonder if he was right. If that degree of honesty is even possible between two people. William's throat tightened. Perhaps honesty is aspirational, my lady. Something to work toward rather than achieve. A convenient philosophy for those with secrets. But she said it without accusation, as though commenting on the weather. He should have left it there. Should have bowed and withdrawn. Instead, he heard himself ask, "Do you believe people can be known, my lady? Truly known?" Eleanor looked at him then, really looked, and William felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with his disguise. "I believe people reveal what they choose to reveal, Mr. Harris." The rest is performance. She closed the book with a soft thud. We're all performing, aren't we? Playing the roles we've been assigned. And if the role doesn't fit? Then we alter ourselves until it does. That's what survival requires. The resignation in her voice undid something in him. This was what he'd wanted to discover, her truth, her authentic self. And now, having glimpsed it through deception, he wanted nothing more than to tell her she was wrong. That survival shouldn't require such complete erasure. That she deserved more than a marriage built on mutual resignation. But he couldn't say any of that. Not as William Harris, servant. Not as William Hartwell, the very Duke she just described as her inevitable fate. "The Montaigne, my lady," he said quietly. "I hope you find what you're seeking in it." "I'm not seeking anything, Mr. Harris. I stopped seeking some time ago." She left him standing in the library, and William understood with perfect, terrible clarity that he'd made a catastrophic mistake. Not in coming here, though that was unforgivable enough. But in believing he could observe her without consequence. Without becoming implicated in the very loneliness he'd witnessed. The night before the Duke's arrival, William found himself unable to sleep. He lay in the narrow servants' quarters, listening to the house settle around him, and contemplated the architecture of his own stupidity. Tomorrow, he would leave before dawn. Return to Greystone, resume his identity, and arrive at Ashford Manor in the afternoon as himself, as the Duke of Greystone, expected and prepared for. Mrs. Graves had been informed that Harris had received urgent family news and would be departing. The story was thin, but servants came and went. No one would think much of it. Except possibly Lady Anne Pembroke, whose sharp eyes had catalogued his every inconsistency. And possibly Eleanor, who spoke to him as though he were human rather than furniture, which was more unsettling than any suspicion. He rose before the household stirred, dressing quickly in the pre-dawn darkness. His belongings, few enough, all borrowed or purchased for the role, would be collected later by his solicitor's men. He moved through the servants' corridors one final time, committing details to memory with the superstitious notion that he should remember what his deception had cost. The music room drew him, though he knew it was foolish. But in the grey morning light, with fog pressing against the windows, he allowed himself one last moment in the space where he'd heard Eleanor play fury like precision. "Leaving without notice, Mr. Harris?" His heart stopped. Eleanor stood in the doorway, wrapped in a dressing gown, her hair loose around her shoulders. He'd never seen her unbound like this, and the intimacy of it felt like theft. "My lady." He bowed, buying time to construct an explanation. "Family emergency. I apologize for the abruptness." "How convenient. The day before the Duke arrives." She moved into the room, and William noted with growing alarm that her usual careful neutrality had been replaced by something sharper. "Tell me, do emergency familial obligations often coincide so precisely with significant household events?" "My lady, I don't." "Lady Anne was right about you." Eleanor stopped a few feet away, close enough that he could see the shadows beneath her eyes. "You don't stand like a servant. You don't speak like one, despite your efforts. And servants don't typically have opinions on Beethoven's emotional architecture." William's mind raced through possible explanations, each more inadequate than the last. He could maintain the fiction, some tragic backstory of fallen circumstances. Or he could confess partially, admit to education without revealing identity. Both options felt equally dishonest. "I apologize if I've made you uncomfortable, my lady." "Uncomfortable?" She laughed, a sound without humor. "You've made me curious, Mr. Harris, which is far more dangerous. I'd resolved not to be curious about anything anymore. It's safer that way. Sometimes safety costs too much." Spoken like someone who's never truly lacked it. But there was no venom in her words, only weariness. "Go, then. Whatever reason brought you here, I hope you found what you sought." He should have left. should have bowed and departed and left her with nothing more than the minor mystery of an odd servant briefly employed. Instead, he found himself speaking with a recklessness that would have alarmed him if he'd paused to consider it. I sought certainty. I thought observation would provide it. I was wrong. Eleanor tilted her head, studying him. Certainty about what? About whether duty and connection might coexist. Whether a marriage built on necessity might still hold something genuine. The words emerged before he could stop them, too honest, too revealing. Whether someone who'd been hurt might still choose to risk being known. The silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither could say. The Duke, Eleanor finally said, her voice carefully neutral, is not a man who traffics in philosophy with his servants. No, my lady. He is not. Then perhaps you're fortunate to be leaving before he arrives. I suspect you'd find his household less tolerant of ambiguity. She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. The Beethoven, Mr. Harris. You asked if I play it as annotated. The answer is yes. Always with precision, never with chaos. It's the only way I know to contain things that might otherwise destroy me. Then she was gone, and William stood alone in the music room as dawn broke over Ashford Manor, understanding with perfect clarity that he'd just had a more honest conversation as a fraudulent servant than he would ever have as a duke. He left through the servants' entrance as the house began to wake, and told himself the ache in his chest was guilt. It was. But it was also regret for a connection built on lies that had somehow felt more real than any truth he'd known. The Duke of Greystone arrived at precisely 3 o'clock, his carriage impeccable, his posture radiating the controlled authority of a man accustomed to deference. Eleanor watched from the drawing-room window as he descended, and felt the careful architecture of her composure threaten to collapse. It was him. Harris. The servant. The man who discussed Montaigne and Beethoven with her, who'd looked at her as though she were a puzzle worth solving rather than a transaction to be completed. He was the Duke of Greystone. Her hands clenched in her skirts, hidden from view. The betrayal was so complete, so elegantly executed, that for a moment she could only marvel at the craft of it. He'd entered her home under false pretenses, observed her in her most unguarded moments, collected her confidences like specimens, and now arrived as himself to claim his prize. She thought she might be sick. Eleanor, he's here. Catherine rushed in, flushed with excitement. Oh, he's handsomer than his portrait suggested. Don't you think? Eleanor couldn't speak. Behind Catherine, her mother appeared, already arranging her expression into one of gracious welcome. The performance was beginning, and Eleanor had been assigned her role long before she'd understood the script. Compose yourself, Eleanor, Lady Ashford said quietly. This is everything we've worked toward. Everything. Yes. Her dignity, her privacy, her foolish momentary belief that someone had seen her as more than a means to an end, all of it sacrificed for security. For Catherine's future. For the preservation of a family name that carried no weight beyond the social fiction they all agreed to maintain. She descended the stairs with mechanical precision, each step measured, and found him waiting in the entrance hall with Mr. Palmer. Up close, without the servant's livery, he was exactly as she should have recognized, the bearing too confident, the gaze too assessing, the entire performance just slightly wrong. How had she missed it? How had she been so monumentally stupid? Lady Eleanor. He bowed with perfect formality. Forgive the intrusion. I'm eager to finalize our arrangement. Our arrangement. As though she'd been complicit in his deception. As though they were partners in this violation rather than what they actually were, manipulator and victim. Your Grace. Her curtsy was flawless, every inch the grateful prospective bride. You honor our house with your presence. If he detected the ice beneath her courtesy, he gave no indication. His expression remained neutral, pleasant, utterly unreadable. The same face he'd worn as Harris, she realized, careful, controlled, revealing nothing of consequence. They gathered in the drawing room, her mother orchestrating the social niceties with desperate competence. Tea was served. Conversation flowed along predictable channels: the weather, the journey from Greystone, the upcoming season. Catherine chattered nervously, filling silences with observations that required no response. And through it all, Eleanor maintained her performance, smiling when appropriate, speaking when required, all while calculating the exact dimensions of her humiliation. He'd heard her play. Had stood in her private sanctuary and listened to her articulate pain through music. Had asked questions designed to extract honesty while offering nothing genuine in return. Worse, far worse, she'd given it. Had spoken to a servant with more candor than she'd ever offered to someone of her own class, because she'd believed the power differential meant safety. That a footman posed no threat to her dignity. "Lady Eleanor, perhaps you might show His Grace the gardens," her mother suggested with determined optimism. "Before the light fails." Of course. Privacy, supervised by propriety. The opportunity for the Duke to assess his acquisition more thoroughly. William, she couldn't think of him as Greystone, not yet, offered his arm with the same careful courtesy he'd shown as Harris. "If Lady Eleanor is amenable." She took his arm because refusing would raise questions she couldn't answer without revealing exactly how thoroughly she'd been fooled. They walked in silence through the neglected gardens, fog curling around overgrown roses, and Eleanor wondered what script he'd prepared for this moment. "Lady Eleanor, I must." "Please don't." Her voice was perfectly modulated, betraying nothing. "Whatever you believe you must explain or justify, I assure you it's unnecessary. You recognize me. Did you imagine I wouldn't?" She kept her eyes on the path ahead. "Or was that part of the design? To observe my reaction when the revelation occurred?" It wasn't. He stopped walking, and she was forced to stop as well or risk obvious rudeness. "I owe you an explanation." "You owe me nothing, Your Grace. We have an arrangement, as you said. I provide legitimacy and heirs. You provide security. Neither requires explanation. Certainly not honesty." William felt the words land like blows, each one deserved. He'd rehearsed this conversation during the carriage ride back to Greystone, had constructed careful explanations that balanced confession with justification. All of them turned to ash in his mouth now, faced with Eleanor's glacial composure. "My first wife," he began, because it was the only truth that mattered, "was not what she seemed. I discovered after her death," he stopped, the old wound still sharp despite years. "I discovered she'd married me for access to my name, my position, while maintaining an entirely separate life I knew nothing about." Eleanor's expression didn't change. "And so you assumed I would do the same." How flattering. "I assumed nothing. I sought certainty. Through deception." She pulled her arm from his, creating distance between them. "You entered my home under false pretenses. You observed me without consent. You extracted confidences through artifice. And now you arrive as yourself, expecting what? Gratitude for the thoroughness of your investigation." The accusations were precise and entirely accurate, and William found he had no defense that didn't insult them both further. "I was wrong." "Yes." She turned to face him fully, and the control in her expression was devastating. "But you achieved your objective, didn't you? You learned that I'm desperate enough to marry a stranger. That I play piano alone because I'm too proud to display emotion publicly. That I've been betrayed before and have resolved never to risk it again." Her voice remained steady, but her hands were fists in her skirts. "You know everything about me, Your Grace, while I know nothing of you except that you're willing to lie with extraordinary commitment." "Eleanor. Lady Eleanor." The correction was sharp. "We're not familiar. We never were. Harris was an invention, and I was foolish enough to mistake fiction for connection." That stung more than anything else, the realization that she'd felt it too, that fragile thread of recognition between them. And he'd poisoned it with dishonesty before it could develop into anything genuine. "I apologize," he said, knowing it was inadequate. Completely and without reservation. You deserved better. I deserve nothing, Your Grace. I'm a woman with a title and no fortune, which is to say I'm a problem-seeking solution. You've provided one. I accept the terms. She straightened her shoulders, and he watched her disappear behind the performance of gratitude he'd seen practiced 100 times in 100 drawing rooms. Shall we return to the house? I'm certain there are arrangements to discuss. I release you from the engagement. The words emerged without planning, but once spoken, William recognized their necessity. Whatever he'd hoped to accomplish through his deception, binding Eleanor to him through her family's desperation felt suddenly unbearable. She stared at him, the careful mask slipping. I beg your pardon. The engagement. I release you from it. Your family will receive financial support regardless, a gift, not contingent on marriage. Enough to settle your father's debts and provide for your sister's future. You're rejecting me. Her voice held an edge he couldn't identify. Because I recognize you. Because I'm not sufficiently grateful for your manipulation. No. Because you deserve the choice I tried to deny you. Because binding you to a marriage you've already described as resignation seems, he struggled for the right word. Cruel. Eleanor laughed, and the sound was bitter enough to make him wince. You think this is mercy? Releasing me after I've accepted publicly? After the entire county knows I'm engaged to the Duke of Greystone? She stepped closer, fury finally breaking through her control. I'll be marked as rejected goods. Unsuitable for a duke's purposes. Do you understand what that does to a woman's prospects? Then we'll marry. He was floundering now, each attempt to repair the damage creating new wreckage. But you should know you have choice in the matter. Choice. She repeated the word as though it were foreign. I have no choice, Your Grace. I never did. You made certain of that when you decided observation trumped honesty. She turned back toward the house. We'll marry as arranged. You'll have your certainty, I'm not your first wife, I'm simply desperate. And I'll have security, purchased at the cost of whatever dignity I had remaining. Eleanor, please. 3 weeks, she interrupted, her voice returning to that terrible neutrality. I believe that was the timeline discussed. Enough time to arrange the ceremony but not so long as to suggest hesitation. Does that suit your Grace's requirements? William wanted to argue, to explain, to somehow undo the cascade of consequences his deception had triggered. But Eleanor's expression had closed completely, and he recognized the futility of further conversation. As you wish, he said quietly. She walked back toward the house without waiting for him, her spine straight and her steps measured, and William understood he'd accomplished something remarkable. He'd ensured his future Duchess would never trust him, never be honest with him, never be anything but the performance she'd just demonstrated. He'd wanted certainty. He'd achieved it. The cost was only everything that mattered. The announcement of the engagement appeared in the Times 3 days later, accompanied by the requisite expressions of joy and anticipation. Eleanor read it over breakfast and felt nothing, which seemed appropriate. Feeling required vulnerability, and she'd resolved to excise that particular weakness entirely. You don't seem happy, Catherine observed, watching her with the uncomfortable perception of younger siblings. Shouldn't you be happy? I'm perfectly content. Eleanor folded the paper with deliberate care. The Duke is everything we could have hoped for. He seems sad, though. When he looks at you, I mean. Like he's lost something. Eleanor's hands stilled. You're imagining things. Am I? Catherine tilted her head, considering. And says there's a story there. She says people don't look at each other like that unless something's happened. Lady Anne should concern herself with her own affairs. But Anne, of course, had no intention of doing any such thing. She arrived that afternoon with the determination of someone who'd scented scandal and refused to be denied details. Tell me everything, she demanded the moment they were alone in the drawing room. And don't bother with the sanitized version. Something happened with that footman, didn't it? Harris? Eleanor considered lying, then discarded the notion as pointless. And would extract the truth eventually through sheer persistence. Harris was the Duke. The silence that followed was profound. "I beg your pardon." And finally managed. "The Duke of Greystone." He posed as a servant for nearly a fortnight. Observing me, I assume. Ensuring I wasn't secretly depraved or fortune-hunting beyond acceptable parameters. Eleanor heard the bitterness in her own voice and didn't care. His first wife deceived him, apparently. He wanted certainty. Anne's expression cycled through shock, outrage, and finally settled on something like grudging admiration. "That's extraordinary. Unethical, certainly, possibly unhinged, but extraordinary." She leaned forward. "What are you going to do?" "Marry him, obviously. We have an arrangement." "Eleanor. What would you have me do, Anne? Refuse? Become the woman too proud to accept a duke? We both know how that ends." Eleanor stood, moving to the window to avoid her friend's too perceptive gaze. "At least this way Catherine is provided for. Mother can stop pretending our situation is recoverable. The debts are settled. And you become wife to a man who violated your privacy and trust before ever meeting you properly. Marriage rarely involves trust. You've said so yourself. I say many things I don't actually mean you should believe." And joined her at the window, her voice softening. "You spoke with him. As Harris, I mean. What was he like?" Eleanor closed her eyes against the memory. "Observant. Thoughtful. He listened as though my opinions mattered. Asked questions that suggested genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation." She laughed without humor. "None of it was real, of course. But it was a skillful performance. Or perhaps it was real, and the performance was pretending otherwise. That's generous." "I'm not feeling generous. I'm furious on your behalf." Anne's hand found Eleanor's shoulder. "But I'm also curious whether a man capable of such elaborate deception might also be capable of genuine feeling. The two aren't mutually exclusive." Eleanor turned to face her friend. "It doesn't matter what he's capable of feeling. He made his priorities clear when he chose investigation over introduction. I'm a problem he's solving, Anne. Nothing more. And if you're wrong, then I'm wrong. But I'll be wrong while financially secure, which is preferable to being right while destitute." And studied her for a long moment. "You're not this cynical. You're pretending to be, because it's safer than admitting you're hurt." The observation landed too close to truth, and Eleanor felt her careful control waver. "Of course I'm hurt. I was foolish enough to be honest with a servant because I thought the power differential meant safety. I told him things I've never told anyone, and all the while he was cataloging my weaknesses for future reference." She forced her voice steady. "But hurt is temporary. This marriage is permanent. I'd rather feel nothing than feel constantly betrayed. Feeling nothing isn't the same as being safe, Eleanor. It's just a slower way of disappearing." Before Eleanor could respond, Mrs. Graves appeared in the doorway. "My lady, a letter from Greystone Manor. The Duke's secretary, regarding wedding arrangements." Eleanor accepted the envelope, breaking the seal with steady hands. Inside was a detailed list of preparations, timelines, expectations, everything organized with military precision. And at the bottom, in handwriting that differed from the secretary's formal script, a single line. "I know I have no right to ask, but might we speak privately before the wedding? There are things I would say that require no audience. W***. She stared at the words, and felt something dangerous stir beneath her carefully constructed numbness. "What does it say?" Anne asked. Eleanor folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket. "Wedding arrangements. Nothing of consequence." The lie came easily. She was learning. Eleanor waited 4 days before responding to William's request, and when she finally did, her note was brief to the point of terseness: tomorrow, 2 o'clock, the gardens at Ashford Manor. She signed it without sentiment, sealed it without hesitation, and told herself she was simply being practical. They would be married in less than 2 weeks. Communication was inevitable. The truth, which she acknowledged only in the privacy of her own thoughts, was that Anne's words had burrowed beneath her defenses. Feeling nothing is just a slower way of disappearing. She'd spent 3 years disappearing after Philip's betrayal, and the prospect of spending a lifetime doing the same felt suddenly unbearable. So she would listen. She would grant William his private audience, hear whatever justifications or apologies he'd prepared, and then she would make a decision about what kind of marriage theirs would be. Coldly transactional, or something with the possibility of thawing. He arrived precisely at 2, and Eleanor noted with bitter amusement that punctuality appeared to be one of his genuine traits, consistent across both identities. He wore no livery now, just the understated elegance of a man whose clothing cost more than most servants earned in a year, and the contrast to Harris was almost painful. Lady Eleanor. He bowed, formal and correct. Thank you for agreeing to meet. She gestured toward the garden path, and they began walking in silence. The autumn air held the first real bite of approaching winter, and Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter, grateful for the physical discomfort. It gave her something to focus on besides the man beside her. I've been trying to determine where to begin, William finally said. Every version sounds like excuse-making. Then perhaps don't begin with justification. Simply tell me what you wanted to say. He was quiet for several paces. I was married at 24 to a woman I'd known for 3 months. Charlotte was beautiful, charming, everything society declared appropriate. We were happy, I thought. Or happy enough. His voice carried no emotion, as though reciting facts about strangers. She died 2 years later in a carriage accident. Returning from what I believed was a visit to her cousin. Eleanor said nothing, sensing there was more. The cousin had died 18 months prior. Charlotte had been visiting her lover, a man she'd apparently been involved with since before our marriage. Our household steward, of all people, who'd been embezzling funds and passing them to her for years. William stopped walking, staring at the overgrown roses. I discovered all of this while settling her affairs. Letters, financial records, an entire architecture of deception I'd been too trusting to notice. I'm sorry. The words were automatic, but she meant them. Betrayal was betrayal, regardless of circumstance. I swore I wouldn't be fooled again. That I'd know exactly who I was marrying, what I was agreeing to. He turned to face her. So when the arrangement with your family was proposed, I told myself observation was prudent. That entering your household as a servant was simply thorough investigation. And what did you discover? That you're nothing like Charlotte. That you're contained because you've been hurt, not because you're deceptive. That you play Beethoven-like prayer and speak to servants as though they're human. His expression finally shifted, showing something raw beneath the careful control. And that I was doing to you exactly what Charlotte did to me, building a relationship on false pretenses. Eleanor absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. The parallel wasn't exact. William's deception had involved observation, not infidelity, but she understood what he was offering. Not justification, but context. A map of the damage that had led to damage. You could have told me, she said quietly. In the garden, that morning. You could have confessed before arriving as yourself. I know. I should have. I was a coward. Yes. She appreciated that he didn't argue the point. So where does that leave us? You have your certainty now. You know I'm not Charlotte. Does that make this marriage more palatable? Eleanor, he stopped, seemed to reconsider. Lady Eleanor. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking if we might begin again. Honestly this time. No more investigation, no more performance. Just 2 people attempting to build something sustainable from wreckage. Sustainable, she repeated. What a romantic proposition. I'm not offering romance. I'm offering partnership. The possibility that duty and connection might coexist, as Harris once said. The reference to their earlier conversation struck her like a physical blow. He'd meant it, then. Or some part of him had, even while deceiving her. I need time, Eleanor heard herself say. To determine whether I can trust anything you say. Whether this contrition is genuine or simply another performance designed to secure a more amenable wife. That's fair. 2 weeks until the wedding. 2 weeks to demonstrate through action rather than words that you're capable of honesty. She met his gaze directly. Can you do that? Yes. Then we have an agreement, Your Grace. Again. William took Eleanor's challenge seriously, which meant the following 2 weeks became an exercise in deliberate transparency that felt, at times, more exposing than his initial deception. He began with letters, not the formal correspondence of engaged couples observed by families, but honest accounts of his daily life at Greystone Manor. He wrote about the tenant farmer whose roof needed repair and the debate over whether to fund it directly or provide materials for the man to maintain his pride. He described his sister's upcoming visit and his dread of her inevitable interrogation about the engagement. He even confessed to burning the morning toast because he'd been distracted reading Eleanor's response to his previous letter. The letters were in signed flourishes of ducal authority. Just William, written in handwriting that was becoming familiar. Eleanor read each one twice. Once quickly, scanning for performance or artifice. Then slowly, analyzing what they revealed. He was conscientious about his responsibilities, she noted. Uncertain about personal relationships. Surprisingly domestic in his concerns, he wrote more about the quality of bread at breakfast than about parliamentary matters. She responded carefully at first, offering polite observations about wedding preparations and weather. But William's consistency wore down her defenses, and gradually her letters lengthened, deepened. She wrote about Catherine's excitement and her mother's anxious micromanaging. About Anne's cynical running commentary on the entire affair. About her own ambivalence, not about the marriage itself, but about whether allowing hope was wisdom or foolishness. Hope feels dangerous, she wrote. Like extending trust to someone who's already demonstrated its limits. But resignation feels like dying slowly. I'm trying to find the space between His response came the next day, I think that space is called courage. You have more of it than I did, They met 3 more times before the wedding, always properly chaperoned, always observing social conventions. But within those constraints, William offered small demonstrations of honesty that felt more intimate than touch. He told her about Charlotte in greater detail, not to justify his deception, but to help Eleanor understand the landscape of his fears. He described the humiliation of discovering the embezzlement, the way servants had looked at him with pity, knowing before he did. The paranoia that had followed, where every kindness felt suspect. I'm not asking you to fix this, he said during one of their supervised walks. I'm simply explaining why trust feels like risk. All trust is risk, Eleanor replied. The question is whether the potential reward justifies it. And does it? For you? She considered this carefully. I don't know yet. Ask me again in a year. Catherine proved to be an unexpected ally in Eleanor's cautious thawing. She liked William immediately, with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of 17, and reported back after each meeting with observations Eleanor found simultaneously irritating and valuable. He asked about your pianoforte playing, Catherine announced after tea at Greystone Manor. Not whether you played, he clearly knew that already, but what you liked to play. And when Mother started to answer, he very politely redirected the question to you specifically. Eleanor absorbed this detail, adding it to her growing catalogue of evidence. William was trying, genuinely trying, to see her as something beyond an arrangement. Lady Anne was less convinced. He's courting you backwards, she observed during one of their private conferences. Usually men pretend to be interested in women's thoughts before marriage, then reveal their true indifference after. He's done the opposite, shown you his worst immediately and is now attempting to demonstrate improvement. Is that better or worse? I genuinely don't know. It's unconventional enough that I can't predict the outcome. And studied her friend. But you're softening toward him. Don't deny it, I can see it in how you speak about him. Eleanor didn't deny it. He's consistent. And consistency is either genuine character or extraordinarily disciplined performance. And you're hoping for genuine character. I'm allowing for the possibility of it. That's different than hoping. But it wasn't, really. Eleanor was hoping, despite every instinct that screamed caution. She was hoping because the alternative, a lifetime of emotional distance from the man she'd share her life with, felt suddenly unbearable. 3 days before the wedding, William sent a package rather than a letter. Inside was sheet music, a recently published piece by a German composer Eleanor had mentioned wanting to try. The accompanying note was brief. Asterisk for the music room at Greystone Manor. Which is yours, entirely. No one will enter without invitation, including me. You deserve space that's solely your own. W***. Eleanor sat with the music for a long time, tracing the notes with her fingers, and felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. It wasn't forgiveness, not quite. But it was the beginning of something that might eventually become trust. She wrote back that evening, thank you. For this, and for understanding why privacy matters. I think we might manage this marriage after all, His response arrived the next morning, just 2 words, I hope so. The wedding took place on a crisp November morning with frost still clinging to the chapel windows. Eleanor had expected to feel numb, protected by the careful distance she'd maintained from the proceedings. Instead, she felt alert in a way that bordered on uncomfortable, aware of every detail, every gaze, every implication of the vows she was about to speak. William waited at the altar in formal dress, his expression unreadable to anyone who hadn't spent 2 weeks learning to interpret his careful neutrality. But Eleanor saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clasped too tightly. He was nervous, she realized. Genuinely uncertain about how this day would conclude. The recognition steadied her. They were both walking into unknown territory, equally exposed. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of ritual and response. Eleanor heard herself speak the vows, felt William's hands, warm despite the chapel's chill, take hers. When he kissed her, brief and chaste as propriety demanded, she caught the faint scent of bergamot and felt an unexpected flutter of something that wasn't quite fear. The wedding breakfast at Greystone Manor was everything her mother had hoped for, elegant, well-attended, a clear demonstration that the Ashford family's fortunes had been spectacularly restored through Eleanor's advantageous match. Catherine glowed with reflected glory, already attracting attention from eligible young men whose interest would have been unthinkable a month prior. Eleanor played her role with practiced ease, accepting congratulations and well wishes with appropriate gratitude. But beneath the performance, she was acutely aware of William beside her, matching her courtesy for courtesy, presenting a united front to their guests while maintaining the careful distance they'd negotiated. You're doing remarkably well, and murmured during a brief moment of relative privacy. The blushing bride routine is very convincing. I'm not blushing. No, but you're not frozen either, which is progress. And glanced toward William, who was speaking with his steward. He keeps looking at you when he thinks you won't notice. Observation. It's apparently his preferred mode. That's not observation, Eleanor. That's concern. Possibly hope. Definitely anxiety about whether you'll ever forgive him. Eleanor didn't respond, because and was right, and acknowledging it aloud felt premature. Forgiveness was still theoretical, something she was working toward without guarantee of arrival. The guests finally departed as afternoon light faded into evening, and Eleanor found herself alone with William in the drawing room of what was now her home. The silence felt weighted with expectation, not the wedding night expectations that propriety demanded, but something more fundamental. They were married now. The performance was complete. What remained was the question of what, precisely, they'd become to each other. "Your rooms are prepared," William said, his formality suggesting nerves. "Adjacent to mine, with a connecting door that locks from your side." "I thought," he stopped, recalibrated. "I wanted you to have control over your privacy." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. "Thank you. And I meant what I said about the music room. It's yours entirely. I've instructed the staff that it's not to be cleaned except at your request. You're being extraordinarily considerate for someone who invaded my privacy so thoroughly." The words emerged sharper than she'd intended, and she watched William absorb them without flinching. "I know. I'm trying to demonstrate that consideration is my preference." Deception was fear. Eleanor moved to the window, looking out over ground she'd need to learn, a household she'd need to manage, a life she'd need to construct from negotiation and caution. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I thought I did, thought marriage was simply performance and duty. But you've complicated that with possibility, and I'm not certain which is more frightening." William crossed the room to stand beside her, careful to maintain distance. "We could begin with honesty. Real honesty, not the strategic version either of us has perfected." "All right." Eleanor turned to face him. "Honestly, I'm terrified. Of trusting you and being proven foolish. Of not trusting you and wasting decades in mutual isolation. Of discovering that the version of you I'm beginning to believe in is another performance." "Honestly," William replied, "I'm also terrified. Of repeating past failures. Of never earning your trust. Of having destroyed the possibility of genuine connection through my own paranoia." He paused. "But I'm also hopeful, which is new. Charlotte's death left me certain that I'd never risk vulnerability again. You've made me reconsider that certainty. That's an enormous responsibility to place on someone you've known a month. I'm not asking you to fix me, Eleanor. I'm asking if we might attempt to build something together. Slowly. Without expectation of perfection." Eleanor studied him, this man who'd deceived her, then spent 2 weeks demonstrating remorse through action rather than words. The fear was still present, sharp beneath her ribs. But so was something else. Curiosity. The dangerous, fragile possibility that honesty might actually be sustainable. "I need time," she finally said. "To learn who you are. Who we are together. Can you give me that without resentment?" "Yes." "Then we have an agreement." She offered her hand, formal as a contract. "We'll attempt partnership. With honesty as the foundation this time." William took her hand, and his grip was warm, steady. "Agreed." The first month of marriage unfolded in careful increments, each day a small negotiation of space and boundaries. Eleanor claimed the music room as promised, spending hours learning its acoustics, the way sound carried differently in the larger space. William kept his word about privacy, never entering uninvited, though she sometimes caught him pausing outside the door when she played. They took breakfast together each morning, a routine that became the scaffolding of their tentative partnership. William read correspondence while Eleanor reviewed household accounts, and gradually conversation developed, small observations about estate matters, questions about each other's preferences, the slow accumulation of domestic knowledge. "You take your tea without sugar," William noted one morning, "but you requested the kitchen stock honey cakes. For guests, or personal preference?" "Catherine visits on Thursdays. She has a weakness for them." He made a note, and Eleanor felt absurdly touched that he was cataloguing her sister's preferences alongside her own. The household staff navigated their new duchess with understandable caution. Eleanor suspected some of them had served during Charlotte's tenure and wondered what stories they'd carried forward. She approached her responsibilities methodically, meeting with the housekeeper and cook, learning routines, making small changes that asserted her presence without demanding wholesale transformation. Mrs. Hemsworth, the housekeeper, proved invaluable. She was 60 if she was a day, with the comfortable authority of someone who'd managed the household through multiple iterations of family drama. It's good to have stability again, she told Eleanor during one of their planning sessions. The master's been adrift since, well, since before. You're good for him, my lady. Eleanor wasn't certain she deserved that assessment, but she appreciated the welcome implicit in it. The nights remained separate. William had meant his promise about the connecting door, and Eleanor kept it locked, grateful for the autonomy. But sometimes, lying awake in unfamiliar darkness, she wondered what she was protecting herself from. William had been nothing but respectful, patient, demonstrably committed to earning trust rather than demanding it. Perhaps she was protecting herself from her own dangerous inclination toward hope. 6 weeks into the marriage, Catherine's Thursday visit brought unexpected revelation. She arrived agitated, unusual for her normally sunny disposition, and Eleanor immediately drew her into the music room for privacy. What's happened? Nothing terrible. Just, confusing. Catherine twisted her hands together. Lord Hartley has been very attentive. Mother's thrilled, obviously. He's wealthy, titled, everything appropriate. But he doesn't ask me anything. About my thoughts, my interests. He speaks to me like I'm decorative. Like my only purpose is to look pleasant and agree enthusiastically. Catherine's eyes welled. Is that what marriage is? Because if so, I don't know if I can bear it. Eleanor felt her heart constrict. This was what she'd accepted, what she'd been prepared to endure before William complicated matters with his awkward, genuine attempts at partnership. Not always, she said carefully. Some marriages allow for more. Like yours? Catherine looked at her hopefully. The Duke seems to actually listen when you speak. To care about your opinions. Did he? Eleanor had been so focused on protecting herself from disappointment that she hadn't properly acknowledged what William was offering. He did listen. He did ask questions and wait for answers. He'd given her space and autonomy and consistent, demonstrated respect. Yes, she admitted. Like mine. Sometimes. After Catherine left, Eleanor found herself wandering to William's study. She knocked, waited for his invitation, then entered to find him surrounded by correspondence and ledgers. I'm sorry, you're busy. She started to retreat. No, please. He stood, clearing space. I was hoping for a reason to stop reviewing grain yields. What do you need? What did she need? Eleanor had spent so long cataloging grievances that she'd forgotten to acknowledge gifts. I wanted to thank you, she said slowly. For the way you've honored our agreement. The patience you've shown. William's expression shifted, surprise, then something warmer. You don't need to thank me for basic decency, Eleanor. Perhaps not. But I want to acknowledge it regardless. She took a breath, gathering courage. I've been so focused on protecting myself from potential harm that I haven't properly recognized what you've been building. This partnership we discussed, I think it might actually be developing. You sound surprised. I am. I thought trust was binary, either present or absent. I'm discovering it's more gradual than that. Accumulated through small demonstrations rather than grand gestures. William moved closer, careful as always not to crowd her. Does that mean you're ready to unlock the connecting door? The question was gentle, without pressure, but Eleanor felt her pulse quicken regardless. I think it means I'm ready to consider it. To acknowledge that separate rooms might be protection I no longer require. There's no urgency, Eleanor. I can wait as long as you need. I know you can. But I'm not certain I want you to anymore. The admission felt terrifying and liberating in equal measure. I'm not promising anything beyond possibility. But possibility feels like progress. William smiled then, genuine and unguarded. Possibility feels like everything. That evening, Eleanor left the connecting door unlocked for the first time. She didn't open it, didn't invite William through, simply removed the barrier and waited to see what would happen. The gesture felt enormous, a declaration written in the language of architecture and trust. William knocked softly near midnight. "Eleanor? May I come in?" She was sitting by the fire in her dressing gown, unable to settle into sleep. "Yes." He entered cautiously, still fully dressed, and took the chair opposite hers rather than approaching the bed. The consideration in that choice made Eleanor's throat tight. "I wasn't certain you'd actually want company," he said. "Just because the door's unlocked doesn't obligate you to anything." "I know. But I wanted," she struggled for the right words. "I wanted to see what this felt like. Being married in more than name. And how does it feel?" "Terrifying. Hopeful. Both simultaneously." Eleanor met his gaze directly. "I keep waiting for the other performance to drop. For you to reveal that this patience has been strategy rather than genuine feeling." William was quiet for a long moment. "After Charlotte died, I convinced myself that emotional distance was wisdom. That marriage could be managed like estate business, clear expectations, defined roles, minimal vulnerability." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "And then I met you. First as an investigation, then as something I hadn't anticipated. And I realized that what I'd been calling wisdom was just cowardice with better branding. That's remarkably self-aware for a duke. I've had 2 months to think about it. Along with considerable motivation to understand where I went wrong." He smiled slightly. "You're not easy to deceive twice, Eleanor. If I wanted to manipulate you, honesty seems the only viable approach." She laughed despite herself. "That's possibly the least romantic thing anyone's ever said. I'm not skilled at romance. I'm skilled at observation, administration, and apparently spectacular lapses in judgment. But I'm trying to learn other skills. Like trust. Like vulnerability. Like believing that partnership might be more sustainable than isolation." Eleanor studied him, this man who'd entered her life through deception and stayed through dogged, awkward sincerity. The fear was still present, would probably always be present to some degree. But it no longer felt insurmountable. "Come here," she said softly. William crossed to her, and when she stood to meet him, he took her hands with the same careful courtesy he'd shown at their wedding. "Tell me what you need. I need to know this is real. That you're not going to disappear back into performance once you're certain of my compliance." "I can't prove that with words, Eleanor. Only with time and consistency." "I know. But you could start by kissing me like you mean it, rather than like it's obligation." His expression shifted, surprise giving way to something heated that made her breath catch. "I've wanted to kiss you properly since that morning in the garden. When you told Harris that duty and connection might coexist. Then stop wanting and start doing." William drew her closer, one hand cupping her face with unexpected tenderness. When he finally kissed her, it was nothing like the chaste brush of lips at their wedding. This was thorough, searching, a question and answer both. Eleanor felt herself responding without conscious decision, her hands finding his shoulders, her body pressing against his. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, William rested his forehead against hers. Was that sufficiently non-obligatory? It was adequate. Adequate? He pulled back to look at her, mock offended. "I'll have you know I've been reliably informed that my kissing is considerably above adequate." "By whom?" "Your previous wife who was conducting an affair with your steward." The joke was risky, but William laughed, a genuine, surprised sound that transformed his face. "Point taken. Perhaps I should practice more. For accuracy. Perhaps you should." They moved to the bed eventually, shedding layers and inhibitions in gradual increments. Eleanor had expected awkwardness, the strangeness of intimacy with someone still partly unknown. Instead she found curiosity, careful attention, William learning her responses with the same focus he brought to everything else. "Tell me if I'm doing something wrong," he murmured against her collarbone. "You're not." "But William?" "Yes." "Stop being quite so careful." I'm not going to break. His laugh was breathless. Noted. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, and Eleanor felt the rigid architecture of her defenses finally, fully collapse. This was trust, she realized. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Eleanor. William's voice was drowsy, content. Thank you. For giving me another chance. For teaching me that honesty might actually be sustainable. She turned to face him, tracing the line of his jaw. Thank you for being patient enough to earn it. And for proving that partnerships built on truth might be worth the risk. Even when they start with spectacular deception. Especially then. We've already survived the worst of each other. Everything else should be relatively simple. William kissed her forehead, gentle and sure. I love you. In case that wasn't clear. Eleanor felt the words settle into her chest, warm and certain. It's becoming clearer. Ask me again tomorrow. I will. And every day after, until you believe it completely. That might take years. Good, William said, pulling her closer. I'm planning on years. Spring arrived at Greystone Manor with the kind of insistent beauty that made Eleanor grateful she'd survived the winter to see it. 6 months of marriage had transformed the estate from unfamiliar territory into something approaching home, not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of small domestic rituals that had become the architecture of their shared life. She found William in the library, reviewing correspondence with the focused attention she'd learned meant either genuine crisis or elaborate avoidance of something else. Given the season, she suspected the latter. Your sister arrives this afternoon, she observed, settling into the chair across from him. You can't hide in ledgers forever. I'm not hiding. I'm preparing strategic responses to inevitable interrogation. Margaret's been here 3 times since the wedding. She's already conducted her interrogation and apparently found our marriage satisfactory. William set down his papers, smiling with the ease that still surprised Eleanor when it appeared. She found you satisfactory. I remain under permanent scrutiny as the brother who managed to bungle courtship so spectacularly that deception seemed the most viable approach. To be fair, it did work eventually. Through no skill of mine. If anything, I succeeded despite my methods, not because of them. Eleanor crossed to him, perching on the edge of his desk with the informality that had replaced their initial careful distance. You succeeded because you were willing to be honest about your failures. That counted for more than perfect execution. He caught her hand, threading their fingers together. And here I thought I succeeded because you were generous enough to forgive catastrophically poor judgment. That too. She leaned down to kiss him, brief but genuine. Though I'm reserving the right to remind you of said poor judgment whenever you become insufferably ducal. Noted. How is the tenant situation in the East Fields? The question was typical William, genuine interest in her opinions on estate management, recognition that partnership extended beyond the personal into the practical. Eleanor had taken to the responsibilities of Duchess with the same methodical approach she'd applied to survival at Ashford Manor, and discovered she had both aptitude and interest in the work. Henderson's roof is repaired, and I've arranged for his daughter to work in the kitchen here. She's bright and eager, and it gives the family additional income. Eleanor pulled out her own notes. But we need to discuss the school situation. The village children deserve better education than the current arrangement provides. They spent the next hour planning, debating, negotiating the balance between fiscal responsibility and social obligation. This was the partnership they'd built, not romance in the traditional sense, but something more durable. Mutual respect, shared purpose, the hard work of constructing trust from honest foundation. Catherine arrived with Margaret that afternoon, now engaged herself to a young baronet who actually listened when she spoke. The 4 of them took tea in the garden, and Eleanor watched William with his sister, the teasing affection between them, the way Margaret's presence softened his habitual reserve. You've made him happy, Margaret said later, when they had a moment alone. I wasn't certain anyone could, after Charlotte. He'd walled himself off so thoroughly. He did the work himself, Eleanor replied. I just gave him reason to try. Don't diminish your role. Forgiveness is harder than bitterness, and you chose the harder path. Had she? Eleanor considered this, watching William and Catherine discuss music with animated enthusiasm. Perhaps forgiveness had felt like risk initially, but it had proven to be liberation. Bitterness would have trapped her as surely as poverty had, just in a different kind of cage. That evening, after their guests retired, Eleanor and William walked the grounds in the long spring twilight. The gardens were beginning to bloom, and Eleanor had plans for expansion, a proper rose arbor, a section dedicated to herbs for the kitchen. Do you ever regret it? William asked suddenly. Agreeing to marry me despite everything? Eleanor considered the question seriously, as it deserved. No. Not even at the beginning, when I was still furious. The marriage gave me freedom I'd never have found otherwise, even before we built partnership into it. I regret the deception still. Even knowing it led here. Good. You should. But William? She stopped, turning to face him in the fading light. I love you. In case that wasn't clear. She watched recognition transform his expression, joy, relief, gratitude all at once. Say it again. I love you. Your spectacular lapses in judgment included. William pulled her close, kissing her with the confidence that 6 months of marriage had developed. I love you too. Have I mentioned that today? Twice at breakfast, once over estate planning, and once before tea. Then I'm behind schedule. I love you, Eleanor. Today and every day forward. Eleanor smiled against his shoulder, feeling the last remnants of defensive walls finally, completely dissolve. They'd built something real from impossible beginning, not despite the deception that had started them, but through the honest work of repair that followed. Years, she murmured. You said you were planning on years. I am. Decades, if you'll have me. I think I will. But ask me again tomorrow, just to be certain. Always, William promised. Every tomorrow we're given.